Hey there, what's up, guys? It's me again, and I've got a problem that I need to discuss with you, and that problem is that I tend to spend way too much time looking through these old newspapers and finding things that are interesting here and there, and not enough time, actually playing around with stuff. The biggest problem I think that I have is that these blog articles that I write tend to drag on and on and on because there's a lot of interesting things to figure out. So I'm still trying to figure out sort of what the right balance is and how to write an article that is interesting and insightful without dragging on too long. You may have seen, let me look up and see when this video will come out. Yeah, you may have seen in the blog post that I came out with on April 7th, which was 2 days ago, that I wrote about the history of the foul strike rule. So this is a pretty interesting rule, and it's actually relevant to our day. This isn't just something that I'm bringing up for, reasons of historical geekery, although I do that from time to time, as you know. So what happened back in baseball in 1894, I think it was, is the National League changed rules and made it so that if you bunted a pitch or if you deliberately fouled off a pitch, it could be called a strike. And the idea was to prevent batters from getting up there and bunting off balls over and over and over again to have endless foul balls and bring the game to a standstill. That's just sound familiar to you, right? If you've watched a lot of baseball over the last, I don't know, probably 30 years, you've probably seen a lot of this sort of thing happening because it's become offensive strategy these days to try to get pitchers to throw as many pitches as possible. Anyway, interestingly enough, back then, of course, nobody was counting pitch counts or thinking about, pitchers having their arms go sore as a result, which I personally believe is more likely to be a superstition of our day than something that's actually rooted in medical science. But that's a completely different topic and something that we don't really want to get into here. I don't want to get too many tomatoes thrown my way. What I'll tell you, though, that is interesting about this is just the ire and the anger that came out when those rules changed. So I didn't go back to 1894 to look at that change to make it so that if you bunted a ball foul, it would be a strike, and a third a bunt foul with 2 strikes would become a strikeout. That was a rule in 1894. The thing that wasn't a rule, though, is that every single foul ball would be a strike up to having 2 strikes. That started in 1901. And not only did that start in 1901, that was part of the major rule changes that the National League came up with before the 1901 season began. And this was the source of a whole ton of controversy. I mean, like controversy equivalent to what we're seeing today when we're talking about the pitch clock. Right, it's a very, very similar thing that was done for very similar reasons. So you can't find this information right now in RetroSheet or Baseball Reference because they haven't gone through all the box scores yet. A couple years ago, when I was doing a 1900 replay, you can only do the National League in 1900 because nobody has bothered to get American League statistics. That's another topic we'll talk about. When I was doing a 1900 National League replay, I created this matrix, this spreadsheet that had all of the lineups and all of the transactions that I could find because I wanted to play with real transactions, and I played it with real life lineups as well. And I realized that it was pretty easy to get the lineup information, just go through each day's box scores, and you could get them really, really easily. There were certain papers in the United States that were very, very good at doing that at the time, especially the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, and other papers that were a bit lesser, but you could count on them from time to time for that information. Transactions were a little bit harder to find because it depends upon whether the home team's paper really covered that or not. That's another story. Anyway, though, when I was looking through this, I realized that I could get attendance figures because almost every game had attendance figures. That becomes controversial in 1901, where you have direct competition between the American League and National League, and suddenly there's an incentive to maybe not report the attendance if it wasn't so high. And that's also where you start seeing rival newspapers in the same cities reporting 2 different attendances depending upon how they felt about that particular team. And I'm guessing depending upon sort of the backroom deals that were going on between the magnates of the club and the journalists. Far be it from me to accuse people of being corrupt, but, go look through the papers yourselves, you'll see it. Anyway, I was looking through this, and I noticed that there were tons of National League games in 1900 that took a long time to play. I'm talking like 2.5 hours, right? Now, there are probably a couple different reasons for that. National League in 1900 went back to one umpire, even though they had two per game in 1899. I think in a couple of years before that, they did that as a cost-saving measure, similar to their decision to contract four teams, right? Which is the way that monopolists would act. Anyway, we won't go too deep into that. Don't want to go into the politics, but you can kind of get a feeling about what I think about this and what I think about that decision making. In addition to that, though, there was also this problem of games being stalled by batters who were kind of selecting pitches and throwing off this one and that one to get to the pitch that they really wanted to get to. And hence, National League President Nick Young decided and really pushed hard in the owners' meetings in February 1901 to have a rule created so that foul balls would count as strikes. Now, I'm baffled that this was not a rule earlier. I grew up watching baseball my whole life. I've watched it since I was like probably a year old or less, right? I've always known that a foul ball is a strike unless you have two strikes on you, and then it's only a strikeout if you bunt it foul, right? I mean, it seems so natural. It's hard for me, even after doing all this research, to believe that that was not always a rule, but it wasn't. In fact, not only was that not a rule, when you go back to 1901 and read about how they were trying to implement this rule, I mean, you would think that they were trying to, try to get the players to run the wrong way around the bases. I mean, it was like the end of the world. It's like the worst possible thing that could have ever happened, and this is going to spell the death of the sport. It was such a controversial rule that Ban Johnson decided that he didn't want to put it in place in the American League, and so the American League and National League played by two different sets of rules. Why does that sound familiar? Where have we heard that before, right? Interesting, huh? Interesting how this stuff happened. Now, you will see this mentioned in history books about this. This is a little different than John McGraw in 1900, which is a story that everybody's ignored, right? People do talk about this thing, but they don't talk about it deep enough. They'll mention it a little bit and you'll think, oh, well, that's just part of, the evolution of the game. What you forget is that everybody was opposed to it. Everybody fought against it. And there were scientific papers talking about how awful this was and how this was going to destroy hitting and that this was going to destroy the fabric of the game. And I'm not just talking about, a couple of big city newspapers saying this. I'm talking about small city newspapers were saying the same thing. I mean, go on to newspapers.com and do a search in 1900 for the words foul, strike together, and you'll find that there's so much information out there and there are so many articles that you don't have the time to read it. That's the reason why I spent like an hour writing this thing. Anyway, it's very, very interesting to look into this, and it's interesting to look at it from the modern perspective in the modern context. The other thing that's interesting to look at, by the way, is that at the same time, there was also a push against sacrifice bunts. In fact, Ban Johnson is on record saying that he would not have necessarily been opposed to completely outlawing bunting at the plate to force all batters to swing away and to call a batter out if he tried to bunt. I don't know about you, but I've heard of that rule before because I've watched the Savannah Bananas here on YouTube. They play by that rule. Boy, isn't that interesting? Did you know that rule almost came about in 1901 because of Ban Johnson? Did you know that people were talking about that type of rule change? Boy, you talk about something that would have really changed the sport. Interesting. Now, of course, the truth behind all of this, as we all know, is that Ban Johnson, if he wanted to, didn't really need to ban the sacrifice bunt. No, all he really needed to do was to get a bunch of intelligent people to come together and prove through mathematics that sacrifice bunts were not as successful and were not as good as swinging away. That's what we've seen. I mean, as soon as that's been proven, then the sacrifice bunt has eradicated itself, and we've had no need to make it illegal. That's sort of the way that it works. Anyways, a little bit of food for thought for you as you encounter these concerns. I was not able to find anybody who said, oh, well, we want the game to be longer because then we get more value for our money, which is the sort of argument I keep coming across today about the pitch clock, right? Which I consider to be completely ridiculous for a sport that is clearly dying. But I'll let you know if I run across one of those as I continue to do research into these subjects. Anyways, very, very interesting stuff. And it's real interesting to see just how similar the arguments at that time were to some of the arguments that come forth today. Now, I'll give you my personal opinion on this, and this is really going to get the Rotten Tomatoes out. Not only do I think that it's good that foul balls are counted as strikes up to the second strike, I would change it to make it so that a third foul ball would also be a strike, to give batters an incentive to stop fouling the stupid ball off every single pitch. That way, maybe when I play Diamond Mine Baseball, I don't have to sit around and play with this game engine that has like 10 foul balls all the time. And these guys having so-called epic at-bats where it's a full count and they just foul a ball off one after another. Get the jerks to stop doing that, right? If you really want to see change in the game, make that rule come forth. And then what you'll notice is that you will no longer have these guys who decide that they're going to get, the bats with the really thin handles that have all of the weight up at the sweet spot. You know what I'm talking about, and then the point is to try to, drive the ball as far as you possibly can off of the sweet spot itself. I mean, no, we wouldn't need to do that, because if you had it so that a foul ball with 2 strikes counted as a strikeout, batters would change their approach right away. And suddenly those bats that have been popular since the 50s would no longer be popular. And then we could have people using bigger bats with bigger handles so that they can push the ball in a certain way so they can make sure it stays fair. And you have the game go back to something that's a little bit more watchable. You'd have fewer home runs though. And of course, we all know that home runs are the thing that drives everything. Anyway, a little bit of food for thought there for you. As I've always said, and those of you who have watched me on Twitter probably know that I do a little bit too much of this. A lot of the statistics around baseball are really just rhetorical arguments. Many of these arguments go back much further than the people who make them think and realize. I mean, many of these arguments go back so far that the people who make them would probably be embarrassed to admit that, yeah, this is an old argument from the 1890s. But it's true. I mean, this stuff happens in cycles. Yeah, if you take the time to look into it, you'll find it yourself. You don't have to wait for a historian to write the book. You don't have to wait for me to make a video. You can go up and look it up yourself. Anyway, there you go. There's a little bit more of that. And I really need to stop doing this because I've got games to play and I've got game write-ups to make as well. But this is a lot of fun, man. I really enjoy it. Anyway, thanks for taking the time with me. Let me know what you think. Bye.